a millionaire with a broken heart, a humble young woman with dreams stuck on the horizon. In a small coastal town, the paths of two worlds so far apart cross unexpectedly. He, in search of redemption, carries the weight of a life that seemed perfect, but collapsed when he discovered a cruel truth about himself. She, full of hope and resilience, lives on the fringes of luxury, but with a spirit that shines brighter than any wealth. When an ocean storm throws their lives into an unlikely confrontation, a simple act of kindness sets off a series of events that no one could have predicted. But not everything is as it seems. There are secrets that the tide holds that can change everything. Before continuing the story, let me know which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Oh, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. The fresh morning wind carried with it the smell of salt and freedom. But for Christopher Sterling, all he felt was the bitter taste of emptiness. Sitting on the balcony of his luxurious vacation home, he stared out at the ocean in front of him, as if waiting for the waves to answer the questions that tormented him. It was there, in that small coastal town, that he sought refuge from the life that had fallen apart. He'd had it all: a stately mansion, a stunning wife, lucrative businesses that made him one of the most influential men in New York. But when he discovered he was infertile, everything fell apart. His wife, Elizabeth, didn't want to fight fate. She preferred to exchange her vows of "in joy and in sorrow" for the warmth of another man's arms. Now Christopher was alone, a millionaire with no heirs, no purpose, trying to find solace in the simplicity he had never known. That morning, he decided to take the jet ski, hoping that the speed and the salt spray on his face would drive away his demons. He put on his life jacket, adjusted the engine, and set off at high speed for the horizon. For a while, the noise of the engine and the bright sun distracted him. The ocean seemed endless, and for the first time in months, Christopher felt free, almost happy. But the calm was abruptly interrupted. The jet ski's engine began to fail. First, it coughed like an asthmatic machine, then it died completely. Christopher was left floating in the middle of the open sea, surrounded by nothing but blue water and the endless sky. He tried to restart the engine, to no avail. His phone was dry, but there was no signal. Panic began to take hold. Hours passed. The sun, once a warm ally, became a cruel enemy, burning his skin and draining his strength. The current dragged him slowly away, towards an uncertain destination. His thoughts swirled between despair and regret. He thought of Elizabeth, of the child he would never have, of the life that seemed perfect but had always been fragile. As night began to fall, Christopher felt his body give in to tiredness. He closed his eyes, thinking that perhaps that was where his story would end. But the current took him to a distant, deserted beach, far from any tourist route. He didn't know it, but fate had other plans. Emily Carter was walking along the fine sand of that remote beach. The daughter of a humble fisherman, she liked to escape to isolated places where she could dream. At 23, she worked as a waitress in a local diner and spent the rest of her time helping her father with the fishing nets. But what really filled her soul was the desire for something greater. She dreamed of a different life, perhaps even a love that would tear her away from that quiet village. When she spotted something on the sand in the distance, Emily thought it was debris washed up by the tide. But as she got closer, she saw a man, passed out, exhausted, clinging to a life jacket as if his life depended on it. She ran over to him, her feet sinking into the wet sand. Sir, are you all right?" Her voice was full of urgency as she shook his shoulder. Christopher opened his eyes with difficulty. For a moment he thought he was in a dream. The sight of that young woman with golden hair reflecting the light of the sunset seemed almost angelic. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry and rough as sand. Only a groan escaped. "Wait, I'll get help," said Emily. But Christopher held her arm with what little strength he had. "No," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Water, please." Emily immediately opened her small backpack, which contained a bottle of water. She helped him take small sips as he tried to sit up. The movement drew a groan of pain from Christopher, but he forced himself to face his savior. "Who are you?" he asked with monumental effort. "My name is Emily. I was walking and saw you here. It seems the tide has brought you—" "Where did you come from?" Christopher shook his head, trying to remember. He didn't want to admit the humiliation of his situation. A millionaire unable to repair even his own life, let alone a simple jet ski. Long story, he replied, his voice firmer now. I need help. Emily looked at him, noticing for the first time the refined features of his face. He didn't look like he belonged there. His clothes, though wet and worn, screamed sophistication, but it was the sadness in his eyes that intrigued her most. Come on, I'll take you to my father's house. He's a fisherman, but he knows how to look after people hurt by the sea. Christopher tried to get up, but his legs failed him. Emily, despite her small build, put her arm around him and helped him walk across the sand. Thank you for helping me. Of course, I would never leave you there, replied Emily simply and directly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. That gesture of pure, unselfish kindness ignited something in Christopher. Something he hadn't felt for years. Hope. Christopher felt the world around him like a dense fog as Emily helped him walk along the path that connected the deserted beach to the village. He had no idea how long he had been adrift or where exactly he had stopped. All he remembered was the jet ski's engine failing and his desperate attempt to fix it, to no avail. The time he had spent at the mercy of the currents seemed like an endless blur. Every step was a challenge, but Emily held on with determination, even though she was much smaller than him. The smell of the sea began to mingle with the scent of damp earth and the surrounding trees. After a few minutes of walking, they came to a small wooden house worn by time and the salt of the ocean, but emanating a welcoming warmth. "This is it," said Emily, helping him up the porch steps. "Come in. I'll call my father." The living room was modest, decorated with simple furniture and colorful fabrics. Faded family photographs were arranged on a sideboard next to shells and small ornaments that clearly had stories behind them. Christopher sat down in a wooden chair, his muscles relaxing for the first time in hours. "Daddy," Emily called out, going into the kitchen, "we have a visitor. He was adrift at sea and I found him lying there on the beach unconscious." A robust man appeared in the doorway, with skin tanned by the sun and hands scarred by hard work. Emily's father's gaze was cautious, but not hostile. "Good evening, sir." His voice was deep, but gentle. "Emily said she found you on the beach." Christopher nodded, still trying to pull himself together. "Yes, I don't know what happened. My jet ski broke down, and after that..." He wiped his hands across his face in frustration. "I just couldn't get back." The man exchanged a quick glance with Emily, and without saying another word went into the kitchen. In a few minutes he returned with a steaming mug. "Take this. Herbal tea. It will warm you up and help you regain your strength." Christopher took the mug with a little nod of thanks. The smell was comforting, a mixture of fresh herbs and something sweet. Each sip felt like a warm embrace, bringing him a sense of security he hadn't felt for a long time. Meanwhile, Emily disappeared for a moment and returned with a towel in her hands. Her mother, a grey-haired woman with a sweet smile, was right behind her, holding a glass of orange juice. "Here, dear," said Emily's mother, handing over the glass. "And the towel is for you to clean yourself. The fresh water is outside in the makeshift shower. It's no luxury, but it will help you feel better." Christopher was amazed at the generosity of that family. People who barely knew him were willing to share what little they had without asking for anything in return. He accepted the towel and the juice, feeling embarrassed but grateful. "Thank you. Really." His voice came out low, almost hoarse with emotion. After an invigorating bath under the cold water and putting on the borrowed clothes Emily's father had given him, a worn but comfortable cotton shirt and baggy pants, Christopher returned to the small living room. The smell of freshly grilled fish filled the room, making his stomach rumble. They sat around a simple wooden table with marks from years of use. Emily's father brought the fish, accompanied by boiled potatoes and homemade bread. "I hope you like it," he said. "It's nothing compared to what you're used to, I imagine, but it's made with care." Christopher took a piece and took his first bite. The taste was simple but incredibly satisfying. He couldn't remember the last time a meal had made him feel so human. Sitting there, surrounded by the Carter family, he watched how everyone interacted. Emily's mother smiled, pouring more juice for everyone, while her father told stories of his fishing trips. Emily, for her part, listened attentively, her eyes shining with genuine admiration. Christopher couldn't look away from Emily. She had a beauty that wasn't just physical. It was the way she laughed discreetly at her father's jokes. The way she took care of the details around her, the affection visible in every little gesture. He felt like an intruder in a world that, although simple, was incredibly rich in something he had never had, true love and complicity. For a moment he wondered how it was possible that such a humble life could carry so much meaning. Watching that family, he realized how lonely his own existence was, despite all the luxury that surrounded it. That night he had to sleep right there. After all, he had no idea how far it was from home, and it was already late. So when he finally lay down on a simple mattress on the floor, provided by Emily's mother, Christopher stared at the wooden ceiling and felt a lump in his throat. For the first time in a long time, he didn't think about his failure to have a son, about Elizabeth or the empire he had left behind. All he could think about was that free-spirited young woman and the peace that seemed to emanate from every corner of that house. But he knew that dawn would bring questions. Who were these people really? Why had fate led him to that isolated beach? Christopher awoke to the sound of birdsong and the distant murmur of waves breaking on the beach. For a moment he was confused, unable to remember where he was. But the aroma of fresh bread and freshly brewed coffee brought him back to reality. He looked around and saw the modest house where he had spent the night. His mind was still processing the welcome he had received from that strange and generous family. He put on the simple clothes Emily's father had lent him and went out onto the veranda. Outside he found a scene that made him smile involuntarily. A small wooden table, covered with a colorful tablecloth and filled with fresh fruit, homemade bread, jam, and a jug of juice. Emily's mother was tidying up the last details, while her father was setting up chairs around it. Emily appeared already dressed in simple clothes that somehow enhanced her natural beauty. Her hair was loose and shining in the morning sun. She gave him a carefree smile. "Good morning, I hope you're hungry," she said lightly. Christopher laughed, still surprised by the warm treatment. "Good morning, Christopher. Honestly, I don't know how to thank you. You didn't have to do all that." Emily's father, sitting at the table, made a casual gesture with his hand, as if to dismiss any formality. "You don't say thank you when you're helping. The sea can be treacherous, but here we look after each other. Now sit down. We don't want the coffee to get cold." Christopher obeyed, taking a seat between Emily and her father. He took a slice of homemade bread, buttering it carefully as he tried to absorb the moment. The warmth of the morning, the light breeze, the distant sound of the waves, and, above all, the occasional laugh that escaped between the stories shared at the table. He felt more relaxed there, in that humble setting, than he had ever felt at his lavish dinners in New York. During the meal, Emily's father looked at him curiously. "So, boy, you said yesterday that you were on a jet ski. Where did it come from? Because if the tide brought you here, you were a long way off." Christopher hesitated for a moment, remembering his vacation home. "My house is in Shelter Point," he replied, mentioning an exclusive beach destination almost 100 kilometers away. "I went out for a walk and, well, things didn't go according to plan." Emily's father whistled, impressed. "Shelter Point? The tide dragged you out for a long time. That explains why you were so exhausted when Emily found you." He looked at his daughter and added with a smile, "And now she's going to be your savior once again. I need to go fishing, but Emily can take you there in our buggy. It's not fast or comfortable, but it'll get you home." Christopher looked at Emily, surprised but grateful. "That's great. Thank you, Emily." "No problem," she said, getting up to get the keys. "But I'll warn you, the buggy has a personality of its own. It will cooperate or not." The old buggy seemed as tough as Emily's spirit. Christopher laughed at the sight of the vehicle, a mixture of rust and improvisation, but which was clearly well loved by the family. They climbed in, and Emily started it up with a loud, vibrant rumble. The road was long, cutting through dirt tracks, small woods, and isolated stretches of beach. Emily drove as if she owned the road, the wind ruffling her hair as she laughed at Christopher's tense expressions. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" he asked, holding on tightly to the side of the buggy as she made a sharp turn. "Of course I do," replied Emily, her voice full of amusement. "I've been doing this since I was 12. Are you scared? Afraid?" He laughed nervously. "I've driven racing cars, but this is another level." "Then you're in the right hands," she said, winking at him as she sped off. The journey, however, was not without its pitfalls. The buggy choked and stopped on a particularly steep stretch. Emily got out cursing at the vehicle, as if it could hear her. Christopher laughed at the scene. It seems that her confidence in the buggy had been exaggerated. "Nothing a bit of brute force can't solve," she retorted, heading for the back of the vehicle. "Are you going to help me, or are you just going to watch?" Christopher sighed, but got down to push. At the first joint effort, the buggy came back to life with a bang, and they both burst out laughing. Christopher realized, to his own surprise, that he was having fun. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed so genuinely. As they continued on their way, they talked about everything and nothing at the same time. Emily talked passionately about fishing, the local landscapes, and her family, while Christopher, for the first time, felt comfortable sharing bits of his life. "We are very different from what I imagined," he said in a moment of silence. "I thought that after everything I'd been through, it would be impossible to find someone so genuine." Emily glanced at him, a soft smile on her face. "Sometimes it's in the most unlikely place that you find what you need." Christopher didn't know if she was referring to the road or something deeper, but he felt a tightness in his chest. At that moment, as the buggy drove along the trails, he realized that Emily wasn't just a good person. She was special and unique. The buggy stopped suddenly, the engine giving off a faint smell of overheating. Emily sighed and turned off the vehicle, getting out to check the situation. Christopher, still laughing about the last time he had to push the old car, crossed his arms and looked at her with a smile. "Don't tell me we're going to push it again." Emily shook her head, smiling. "Not this time. The engine's only warm. Let's wait a bit. This happens from time to time. You can use the time to rest." She sat down on a large stone by the side of the dirt road, gesturing for Christopher to do the same. He hesitated for a moment, but decided to join her. The sun was shining brightly, but a cool breeze was blowing, making the moment strangely pleasant. "So, Emily," began Christopher, trying to strike up a conversation, "you seem so connected to this place. Have you ever thought about living somewhere else?" Emily looked at the horizon, a wistful smile appearing on her face. "I love this city, you know. It's my home. I grew up here. I know every beach, every trail, every little face that passes through here. But," she paused as if choosing the right words, "but sometimes I dream of seeing what's beyond here. Going to a big city, seeing those huge buildings that touch the sky, the lights shining at night, like stars on Earth. I want to go to the cinema for real, not just watch the old movies we have at the community center. And also, study. I've always wanted to learn more. Medicine, perhaps, or something that allows me to help people in a different way." Christopher remained silent, absorbing every word. He noticed the sparkle in her eyes as she spoke, a mixture of passion and hope that touched him deeply. He, who had been looking for a refuge in that coastal town to escape everything he found unbearable in his life, found a young woman there who dreamed of exactly what he was running away from. "That's incredible," he said at last. "You have a very free spirit, Emily. I don't think many people would have the courage to dream so big living in such a small place." Emily shrugged, but the smile on her face was unmistakable. "Maybe, but I know the reality is different. Life here is what I know. I don't have much, but I also don't know if I could live in a place where everything is so big. Sometimes I think these dreams are just that, dreams." Christopher frowned. Something inside him didn't want her to give up on these dreams, didn't want her to resign herself to the idea that it wasn't possible. "You're wrong," he said, his voice full of conviction. "You must never think like that. Dreams are what keep us alive, Emily. And you have a sparkle in your eye that can take you anywhere." Emily looked at him in surprise, as if those words had come from a place she hadn't expected. There was something about Christopher, a weight in his words, perhaps, or the intensity with which he stared at her, that made her heart beat faster. She looked away from the buggy, trying to hide the blush that rose to her cheeks. Christopher, for his part, felt a wave of gratitude for that moment. He had never felt so at ease with anyone, and Emily's simplicity made him feel something new, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It was then that he had an idea. "Emily," he began, hesitating, "I want to repay you for what you and your family have done for me. Why don't you come and spend a few days with me in New York? I could show you the lights, the buildings, everything you've always wanted to see." Emily widened her eyes, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. "What? Are you serious? Are you serious? Completely serious? You saved my life. It's the least I can do." For a moment, Emily was paralyzed. Then a broad smile lit up her face, and before she could think, she threw herself into a hug with Christopher. He was surprised but reciprocated, laughing at her enthusiasm. "My God, that would be incredible," she said, still hugging him. "I don't even know what to say. Thank you. Thank you." It was at that moment that something changed. They both felt an inexplicable current running through their bodies the moment their gazes met. The hug, which began as a gesture of joy, became something deeper, more intimate. They both pulled away suddenly, disconcerted. Emily fiddled with her hair, trying to disguise it. "I think the engine must have cooled down by now. I'll start the buggy." Christopher cleared his throat, uncomfortable, but smiling at the same time. "That's a good idea. Let's see if he can take us back this time." As Emily turned the key and the engine roared again, neither of them could forget that moment. Emily had no idea she was standing next to a millionaire, and Christopher wondered how fate could have crossed their lives in such an unlikely way. The buggy drove slowly along Shelter Point's main road, and the difference between Emily's simple village and the sophisticated town was obvious. The streets were lined with elegant stores, charming cafes and modern buildings, all in perfect harmony with the coastal landscape. Emily watched everything with wide eyes, absorbing every detail. "We're almost there," said Christopher, breaking the silence. "But before we go home, I want to take you to a special place. You must be hungry after all the work you've done with me." Emily looked at him in surprise. "There's no need, Christopher. You've already done so much." "Please, it's the least I can do," he insisted with a smile. "Besides, the chef is a friend of mine, and I'm sure you'll love it. It's one of the best in the region." She hesitated for a moment, but her stomach rumbled before she could refuse again. They both laughed, and Emily finally agreed. "That's fine, but only because I'm starving." The restaurant was close to the beach, with a decor that mixed elegance and relaxation. Paper lanterns hung from the ceiling, while large glass windows offered a breathtaking view of the sea. The tables were made of light wood, and blue and white details gave the place a cozy and sophisticated feel at the same time. Emily walked in with Christopher and immediately felt out of place. The setting was beautiful, yes, but it seemed expensive. She looked down at her simple clothes and felt slightly uncomfortable. Before she could say anything, a tall, smiling man with an apron tied around his waist came towards them. "Christopher Sterling," exclaimed the man, opening his arms. "I thought I'd never see you around here again." Christopher stood up to greet him, smiling. "Good afternoon, Victor. I didn't know you were still here. The restaurant looks better than ever." "Thanks to you, my friend. Your recommendations always bring in new customers." Victor then looked at Emily and smiled warmly. "And who are you?" Christopher gestured to her with a smile. "This is Emily, my savior, literally. She got me out of a very tricky situation. Without her, I would have been fish food." Victor laughed, as did other customers at nearby tables who heard the comment. Emily, although blushing, began to relax. The atmosphere, which had once seemed oppressive, now became lighter and more relaxed. "Well, anyone who saves Christopher deserves the best. I'll prepare something special for you," said Victor before disappearing into the kitchen. Emily looked at Christopher, still with a glint of uncertainty in her eyes. "Do you know the chef?" she asked, trying to hide her curiosity. "For years," he replied casually. "We met when I was buying wines for an event. I ended up recommending his restaurant to a few people, and the rest is history." Emily nodded, but didn't fail to notice how the people in the restaurant greeted him with enthusiasm and respect. The impression that Christopher was more than he seemed grew inside her, but she kept her thoughts to herself. The food arrived, and Emily was stunned. Beautifully assembled plates were placed in front of her, fresh seafood, vibrant salads, and soft breads. She tried a little of everything, amazed by the flavors. "This is incredible," she said, almost speechless. "I've never eaten anything like it." "I'm glad you like it," replied Christopher, smiling with satisfaction at seeing her so delighted. Lunch was light and full of laughter, mainly because Christopher made a point of keeping the tone relaxed. He told funny stories about disastrous encounters he'd had and listened to Emily talk about the peculiarities of her village. When they had finished, Victor came back to say goodbye, and Emily realized how different that little break in the routine already made her feel. The buggy headed down the road again, with Emily at the wheel. She was calmer, but her mind was working non-stop. Christopher was an enigma, simple and humble in his way of acting, but surrounded by signs of a great life. She couldn't understand how someone like him had appeared in her life so suddenly. Finally, they arrived at Christopher's house. Or rather, the mansion. Emily parked the buggy and stood in silence for a few seconds, observing the imposing building. The house had a modern design, with large glass windows that reflected the golden glow of the sun. Huge balconies and an infinity pool gave the place a cinematic feel. "This is your house?" she asked, almost in disbelief. Christopher got out of the buggy and turned to her, shoving his hands in his pockets. "It is, or at least my vacation home." Emily got out of the vehicle slowly, still admiring every detail. She seemed lost in thought, almost afraid to step foot in it. "You must be someone very important, aren't you?" she asked, looking at him sideways. Christopher hesitated, his gaze softening as he watched her. He saw something in Emily at that moment, her genuine surprise, her delight at something so different from her reality. She was a perfect contrast to everything he knew, and that contrast moved him in a way he couldn't explain. "I'm just a lucky guy," he replied, trying to sound casual. "Nothing more." Emily laughed, suspiciously, but didn't insist. As she looked around, Christopher watched her. Something inside him seemed to burn, a sudden desire to keep her close, to show her everything he could offer. He didn't know if it was gratitude or something deeper, but for the first time in years he felt alive again. And there, in that moment, he realized Emily was different, and he would do anything to keep her in his life. Christopher was absorbed in thought as he watched Emily, still marveling at the immensity of the mansion. The idea of letting her simply go back to her village, as if nothing had happened, seemed unbearable. He needed an excuse, a plan to ensure that their paths would continue to cross. "Emily," he said, breaking the silence, "I have a proposition. Why don't you leave the buggy here? I'll call a mechanic to fix it. Consider it part of my thanks. It's the least I can do." Emily raised her eyebrows in surprise but shook her head in the negative. "You don't have to do that, Christopher. The buggy is fine. I mean, as much as possible. It's stubborn, but it works." "It works when it wants to," he replied, laughing. "Please leave it to me. I'll make sure it gets back to you in perfect condition." Emily hesitated, but the idea of having the buggy running well was tempting. Finally, she gave in, albeit with a wary expression. "Fine, but only because it will be a great help to my father, too. This buggy has done so much work that it's almost family." Christopher smiled, pleased. He didn't just want to help. He wanted more time with her, a way to create new memories and maintain the connection that was growing. "Good. And as I said before, the invitation to New York still stands. You just have to accept." She laughed, shaking her head. "You really want me to accept, don't you?" "It's more than that, Emily. I want you to see the world beyond here. It's an opportunity, and I know it will be unforgettable." "All right, I'll think about the invitation. But first, take me home, Mr. Substitute Mechanic," she said with a mischievous smile. The drive back to the village was completely different. In Christopher's luxurious 4x4, Emily was like a child discovering a new toy. She opened the window and put her head and hand out, feeling the wind ruffle her hair. Christopher watched in fascination as she giggled to herself, enchanted by something so simple. "This is incredible," she said, turning her head towards him. "How come you don't do this all the time?" "I don't think I've ever thought of it like that," he replied, genuinely impressed by what made her happy. Emily went back to looking at the horizon, and Christopher took a moment to reflect. She was everything he didn't know he needed. Light, simple, full of an energy that illuminated even the most ordinary moments. When they finally reached the village, he felt his heart squeeze. It was time to say goodbye, and he knew that going back to his isolated life would be much harder after meeting Emily and her family. At Emily's house, her parents welcomed them with warm smiles. The mother brought tea while the father thanked Christopher again for offering to fix the buggy. Before leaving, Christopher made a point of handing over a small souvenir he had quickly picked up at his mansion, a beautiful fish frame to decorate their home. "You didn't have to, boy," said Emily's father, visibly moved, "but I'll treasure this. You've done so much for me. It's just a way of showing my gratitude," replied Christopher. After formalizing the invitation for Emily to visit New York, Christopher realized it was time to go. He said goodbye to her parents with a warm handshake and a genuine smile, but his gaze was constantly drawn to Emily. "I'll take you to the car," she said suddenly, as if she too wanted to extend that moment a little longer. The two of them walked in silence to the car. Night was beginning to fall, and the breeze carried the scent of the sea mixed with the surrounding vegetation. When they reached the 4 Christopher hesitated. He didn't want to go, but he didn't know how to say it. Emily seemed equally uncomfortable, fiddling with her hair and avoiding looking at him directly. "Well, I guess that's it," he said, forcing a smile as he opened the car door. But instead of getting in, he closed the door and took a step towards Emily. Without thinking, he pulled her into a tight hug. She didn't resist, wrapping her arms around him. They stayed like that for a long moment, just listening to their hearts beating, feeling each other's warmth. The world around them seemed to disappear. There were no more mansions, beaches, or villages. Just them, trapped in a bubble of feelings that neither of them could name. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, Christopher leaned in and found Emily's lips. The kiss was slow, deep, charged with emotions they both barely understood. It was a mixture of gratitude, desire, and something more, something that made the ground seem to disappear beneath their feet. When they finally separated, they stood there, their faces close together, both trying to catch their breath. "I guess that wasn't in the plans," said Christopher, smiling slightly. Emily laughed nervously but didn't move away. "Nor mine." He tucked a lock of her hair behind her ear and, for a moment, thought about giving it all up and staying there, in that village, with her. But he knew he had to go, at least for now. "See you later, Emily." "See you later, Christopher." She watched him get into the car and drive off, feeling her heart squeeze. Something inside her told her that this was just the beginning of something that would change their lives forever. The next day dawned with Christopher restless. He paced back and forth in the mansion's large living room, his thoughts always returning to Emily. Her laugh, her smile, the way she made something so simple seem extraordinary. He couldn't get her out of his mind, and the more he tried, the more her image seemed to be engraved on his heart. Finally, he decided that he needed to see her again. But how? He didn't want to look like a fool, and yet the urge to be by her side was uncontrollable. That's when he had the perfect idea: the buggy. He called the mechanic and insisted that the vehicle be fixed immediately. "I want it ready by the end of the day," said Christopher, almost begging. The mechanic, although surprised by the urgency, complied. By evening, the buggy was not only working, but shining like new. Christopher looked at the vehicle and smiled. It was the perfect excuse to see her again. When he arrived at Emily's house, his heart raced. She appeared at the door, her loose hair illuminated by the golden evening light. She looked more beautiful than ever in a simple dress that seemed tailor-made for her. When she saw him, she broke into a radiant smile. "Christopher," she said, coming down the steps. "The buggy. It looks brand new." Christopher got out of the vehicle, his heart pounding. Without thinking, he gently took her hand and looked into her eyes. "Emily, I needed to see you today. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since yesterday. That's what brought me here." She was speechless for a moment, feeling the warmth of his touch. Then she smiled, lowering her eyes before confessing, "Me too. I can't forget what happened yesterday." Before they could say anything else, Emily's father appeared, and her reaction to the buggy was one of pure delight. "My God, Christopher, it's brand new. It doesn't even look like the same car. Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart." Christopher thanked him with a nod, but his gaze remained on Emily. She, in turn, looked at the buggy as if she had an idea. "I think it's time to try it out, don't you?" she said, smiling at Christopher. "I'll take you back home." He understood what she really meant. They both needed an excuse to spend more time together. "Of course," he replied, joining in the fun, "but only if you promise to be less adventurous this time." She laughed, and after saying goodbye to her parents, took the wheel of the buggy. The drive was uneventful but full of laughter and furtive glances. Christopher couldn't look away from Emily as she drove, now more carefully, but still full of energy and charm. "So, approved?" she asked, winking at him as the buggy glided smoothly down the road. "Perfect. You and the buggy," he replied with a sincere smile. When they arrived at Christopher's mansion, Emily was surprised to find a table set up on the veranda, decorated with candles and flowers, and dishes impeccably served. The setting was romantic, like something out of a fairy tale. She stopped, looking at him. "Christopher, did you do this for me?" He smiled, shoving his hands in his pockets. "I did it for us. I wanted our night to be special." She was speechless, but his smile was answer enough. They sat down to dinner, and Emily was delighted with every detail, from the impeccably prepared food to the way Christopher made her feel important. They laughed and talked, and for a moment, it seemed as if the outside world didn't exist. After dinner, Christopher took her to the mansion's veranda, where two sun loungers were positioned facing the sea and the starry sky. They lay side by side, looking up at the stars that sparkled like diamonds. "I've never seen such a beautiful sky," said Emily, her voice soft. "It's as if each star has a story to tell." Christopher turned his face towards her, his eyes capturing the brilliance of the sky and something deeper. "Maybe it does. Maybe the stars are telling our story now." Emily turned to him, their faces so close they could feel each other's breath. Slowly, he leaned in and kissed her. The kiss was different from the night before, deeper, more charged with emotion. When they finally pulled away, Emily smiled shyly. "That wasn't in my plans for today, but it was in mine," he replied with a smile. Without another word, he pulled her close, and there, under the infinite sky, they let themselves be carried away by the moment. Later, inside the mansion, they had their first night of love. It was as if the whole world had stopped, leaving just the two of them, enveloped in something that seemed bigger than they could both comprehend. Soft morning light filtered through the bedroom curtains, and Emily woke to the sound of light footsteps and the irresistible aroma of freshly brewed coffee. When she opened her eyes, she saw Christopher entering with a breakfast tray, a warm smile lighting up his face. "Good morning, Princess," he said, placing the tray on the bed. Emily blinked, astonished. The tray was full: fresh fruit, toast, scrambled eggs, and a small bouquet of flowers in the corner. Never in her life had she imagined anything like this. "Christopher, you didn't have to do that." His voice was a whisper, but the smile on his lips revealed his joy. "Of course I did." He sat down next to her, handing her a cup of coffee. "It's the least after the night we've had. I want you to feel special because, well, you are." She blushed, smiling shyly. Christopher's every gesture seemed like something out of a dream, and she still couldn't believe she was there, living it all. After breakfast, they decided to spend the day at the beach. Christopher took her to a hidden cove, surrounded by rocks and crystal-clear waters. They spent hours swimming, laughing and exploring the place like children. Emily felt free, as if the weight of the world had disappeared. But that lightness was interrupted by an insistent ring on Christopher's cell phone. "I'm sorry, I have to take this," he said, stepping away to take the call. On the other end of the line, his lawyer's serious voice brought bad news. An unexpected problem had arisen at his company in New York, and his presence was essential. He had to come back the next day without fail. Christopher hung up the phone, his heart heavy. When he turned back to Emily, he saw in her expression that something was wrong. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice cautious. "I have to go back to New York tomorrow," he replied, sitting down next to her on the sand. "Something urgent has happened at the company and I can't put it off." Emily tried to hide the sadness that immediately gripped her heart. They had just started something special and now he had to leave. Still, she tried to smile. "It's part of it, isn't it? You have responsibilities." Christopher held her hand, his eyes fixed on hers. "I don't want to go, but I have to. And I want you to come too, Emily. I know you're hesitating, but I want you to think about it. Get your things together and come and spend some time with me. It's not just an invitation to New York. It's an invitation to be together." Emily felt a mixture of fear and happiness. As much as she wanted to go, doubts consumed her. Everything was happening so quickly. She had only known him for a few days, and although there was an intense connection between them, the fear of the unknown made her hesitate. I'll think about it," she replied sincerely. "I promise." Christopher noticed her reluctance and respected it, but he also knew that he didn't want that last day to go to waste. He took her by the hand and smiled. "So, let's make the most of the time we have. I'm not letting you go home today." The rest of the day was filled with laughter and unforgettable moments. Christopher took Emily for walks in places she had never seen, even though she lived so close. They visited cliffs, had ice cream at a small kiosk by the sea, and drove along the coast, with the wind ruffling their hair and their hearts beating to the same rhythm. The desire between them was palpable, burning, but there was also a sweetness that made every touch and kiss unforgettable. It was as if time was running out on them, and they both wanted to capture every second before the inevitable separation. The next morning, the farewell was painful. Christopher put his luggage in the car, while Emily, beside him, struggled to hold back her tears. He hugged her tightly, whispering in her ear, "This isn't goodbye, Emily. It's just goodbye. Do you promise you'll call me?" "I promise," she replied, trying to smile. "And I promise to think about the invitation." He kissed her one last time before getting into the car. Emily stood at the entrance to the mansion, watching the car disappear down the road. She felt torn in half. One part of her wanted to run after him and tell him she was going to New York right now, while the other was filled with fear at taking such a big leap. Emily drove the buggy home. The vehicle, now perfect, had no problems, but her mind was far away. Every kilometer she traveled was marked by memories of the past few days. Christopher's laughter, the warmth of his touch, the sweet words he had said. When she finally reached the village, she parked the buggy and sat for a while, looking at the horizon. She felt heartbroken, but at the same time she was overwhelmed by a sense of gratitude. The last few days had been the happiest of her life. Even though she was uncertain about the future, she knew that Christopher had left a mark on her soul that would never fade. Emily and Christopher spoke on the phone every day, exchanging laughs, outbursts, and increasingly passionate declarations. The distance seemed smaller with each conversation, and they already considered themselves connected as a couple, although they hadn't made anything official yet. Christopher was focused on solving the company's urgent problems in New York, while Emily, with her heart warmed and full of anticipation, was organizing her life for the trip. She had decided to spend a week in New York. She knew she wanted more, much more, but she wanted to take it easy. This week would be an opportunity to get to know him better, beyond the kind and passionate man she had helped on the beach. It would be the first step towards something more solid. However, her excitement began to be overshadowed by a constant feeling of unease. Emily often felt dizzy, nauseous, and had a feeling of weakness that wouldn't go away. The planning of the trip was postponed, and when Christopher heard about the situation, he immediately became worried. "Emily, you need to take care of yourself. Go to the doctor. Whatever you need, I'll sort it out." "I will. Don't worry about it. It's probably just tiredness or something I ate," she replied, trying to minimize the situation. But the symptoms got worse. Days passed and Emily could barely eat. Her worried mother insisted that she go to the hospital, and Emily reluctantly gave in. When Christopher received the news that she was in hospital, he didn't think twice. He took his private jet and flew straight to the small town where Emily lived. At the hospital, the atmosphere was tense. Emily was pale and haggard, her parents by her bedside, while Christopher, in a suit and with dark circles under his eyes from worry, held her hand. He tried to convey strength, but inside he was restless, fearing the worst. "I've already asked the doctors to bring in the best specialists if necessary," he said, trying to control his trembling voice. "Don't worry, Emily. Whatever it is, we'll sort it out." She smiled faintly, touched by his care. Soon the doctor entered the room, holding a medical chart and flashing a smile that confused everyone. The tension in the room turned to bewilderment. "Don't worry," he began, placing the chart on the table. "They're fine." Silence dominated the room. Emily, her parents, and Christopher exchanged confused glances until her father broke the silence. "They? Who, doctor?" The doctor smiled even wider, picking up the ultrasound and showing the image on the screen. "She's pregnant with twins. And they're both perfectly healthy. Look here, their little hearts are strong and beating steadily." The news hit the room like a bombshell. Emily's eyes widened, her hands covering her mouth in shock. Her parents exchanged incredulous glances, and Christopher, he froze, his eyes fixed on the screen where the little dots flashed, marking the beats of the hearts. Then, slowly, he sat down on a nearby chair and covered his face with his hands. "Christopher?" Emily called out, worried about his reaction, but he didn't answer. A movie flashed through his head, the voice of Elizabeth, his ex-wife, echoing cruelly. "You're useless. You can't even be a father. Sterile. A failure." These words, spoken in a moment of anger, had haunted him for years. And now, faced with that revelation, he couldn't hold back the tears. The sobs came strong, and he began to weep openly. Emily, although still in shock, tried to sit up in bed to reach him. "Christopher, is everything all right? Why are you crying like that?" she asked, her voice full of concern. He looked at her, his eyes red, and tried to speak between sobs. "They said I could never—" He choked on the words. "They said it was impossible for me to be a father, that I was incapable, and now— Emily, I can't believe it. Is it real?" She reached out, holding his face lovingly. "It's real, Christopher." Her voice trembled, but now it was with emotion. "We're going to have twins." He held her hand against his cheek, letting the tears roll freely. It was as if the weight of years of pain and doubt was being washed away. His parents, still processing the news, stood in silence, absorbing the moment. "You're both going to be great parents," said the doctor, smiling before walking off to leave them alone. Christopher approached Emily and hugged her tightly, feeling the warmth of her and the little miracles she was carrying. There, in the midst of emotion and tears, he made a silent promise. He would do everything in his power to protect this woman and the children they now shared. The months that followed were like a dream for Christopher and Emily. Their relationship, which was already intense, deepened even more with the unexpected arrival of twins. Christopher dedicated himself to looking after Emily, showering her with love and support as she adjusted to her new reality. He wanted to ensure that nothing was missing for her or the babies. Emily, for her part, was overjoyed. Even with the challenges of pregnancy, she felt more loved and secure than ever. The connection between them grew every day, and one quiet evening, under the same starry sky where it all began, Christopher asked her to marry him. "Emily, from the moment you saved me on that beach, my life changed forever. You gave me a reason to believe in love again, and now you and our children are all I could ever dream of. Will you marry me?" She cried and laughed at the same time, the yes coming out between sobs of happiness. The ceremony took place at Christopher's mansion by the beach, with the sound of the waves as the soundtrack. Emily looked stunning in a simple but elegant dress that highlighted her natural beauty. As Christopher watched her walk down the makeshift aisle on the sand, he could hardly hold back his tears. The vows were full of emotion. Christopher promised to love and protect her forever, while Emily, her voice breaking, thanked him for changing her life and for being the man she had always dreamed of. Friends and family applauded as they exchanged rings and sealed the marriage with a passionate kiss. Months later, the twins arrived, 2 strong, healthy boys. Christopher was completely fascinated, holding them in his arms for the first time. Emily, tired but with a radiant smile, watched him with love. "You're the best father they could ever have," she said, as he carefully cradled the babies. "And you're the most incredible mother I've ever met," he replied, his eyes shining. The days that followed were filled with laughter, diaper changes, and sleepless nights, but none of that mattered. They were happy, united as a family that had found the true meaning of love. The news of Christopher's pregnancy and marriage reached the ears of Elizabeth, his ex-wife, who was furious. For years she had blamed Christopher for not being able to have children, refusing to accept that it was her problem. Now, seeing him build a full and happy life with Emily, she felt a wave of envy and anger. "He left me for someone else and still managed to have children," she complained to her friends, unable to accept the truth. Elizabeth tried to contact Christopher, but he paid no attention. For him, that part of his life was over. There was no more hurt, just indifference. All that mattered now was Emily, their children, and the future they were building together. At the mansion, the new routine was full of love and laughter. Christopher often stopped to watch Emily playing with the twins in the garden or rocking them to sleep, and felt overwhelmed by a happiness he had never imagined possible. "You've given me everything I ever wanted, Emily," he said one night as they stood together on the balcony looking at the stars. "It wasn't just me, Christopher. We did it together." She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Now we have everything we need," and they really did. Their love, built in an unexpected way, was the basis of a beautiful, complete family. The challenges of the past were just distant memories, while the present was full and the future bright. Under that same starry sky where their story began, Christopher and Emily found the kind of happiness that even the world's greatest fortunes couldn't buy. True love can appear when we least expect it, bringing light and joy in ways we could never imagine. Life has mysterious paths, and it is often in the simplest moments and the most unexpected places that we find what really gives meaning to our journey. Don't be afraid to believe in fate, to open your heart and allow life to surprise you. Love always finds its way. If this story touched you, leave a like and share it with your loved ones. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories.